Hey, Genesis family. This week's word of encouragement comes to us from Paul's letter to Philemon. In verse 6, he writes, I pray that you may be active in sharing your faith, so that you may have a full understanding of every good thing we have in Christ. I've recently had the privilege of sharing my personal testimony with several different people. As I've heard myself recount the events that led me to give my life to Jesus, I have become renewed in my faith. I've experienced bursts of joy. I have a greater appreciation for the cross and the resurrection, and I have a more firm conviction in the power of the gospel to transform people's lives. So I thought I'd take some time in this video to share my story with you. Many of you have heard it before, in whole or in parts through my sermon. But I hope that you'll give me some time to recall what God has done in giving me faith in Jesus. I grew up as the youngest of 5 and the only boy in a small town in central Illinois. I was the apple of my father's eye. My dad was a hardworking man. He worked 40 hours in a factory throughout the week, and then he started his own business of mowing yards, where he mowed over 40 yards plus cemeteries and businesses, just to put food on the table. My mom was a hardworking woman. She didn't work outside the home, but she kept her house well. She made sure that we ate. She watched over our health and our education. I got a great work ethic from my parents, which I am so grateful for today. But we did not go to church. God was not a part of our life. The only religious influence I had growing up was my grandmother. She divorced my grandfather when my dad was just a young boy. So she leaned into her faith, and she would take us to her Lutheran church any chance that she could. But God was distant to me. It was not anything that I was interested in. I was trying to find myself, and so as I grew into my teen years, I was searching. I got together with other kids just like me, and we formed a gang, and we did a bunch of stuff. We broke into property, we stole things, we harassed people. We did all kinds of stuff, and by the time I was 14, I found myself in trouble with the law. And for a period of several years, I was on probation, getting in trouble more and more. When I was 16, I got a DUI, and I was ordered to go through alcohol and drug treatment after spending a week in juvenile detention. It was at this alcohol and drug treatment program where I was introduced to spirituality. It was a 12-step program that told me that I needed to admit that I was powerless and I needed to find a higher power. I was not very serious about any change. I had no ambition. And so I went through that program and I excelled. I was the peer leader and I graduated it with flying colors, and then got out and promptly slid back into using and abusing alcohol and other drugs. I got into all kinds of drugs, every kind imaginable. And by the time I was 18, I had quit school, I was paranoid, and I was very angry and felt like the world was against me. In a drunken rage, I did some terrible damage to public property, and I was promptly arrested. As I was awaiting arraignment, hung over in a jail cell, a man in a 3-piece suit came in. He was a lawyer, but he wasn't there to get business. He was there to testify to his faith. He would go from cell to cell, and he came to mine and told me that he was in the same cell I was in 15 years before, strung out on heroin and cocaine. But Jesus Christ had come into his life, and he began to talk to me about a new life, a fresh start. He began to talk about forgiveness of sin and an opportunity to start again. Everything within me wanted what he was selling, but I was fearful. I didn't know who my community would be, and I didn't want to be a religious fanatic. So when it came time for him to ask me if I wanted to give my life to Jesus, I said no. He prayed for me, and I went on my way. At the same time, I was at an all-time low. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with me in my hometown. But there was one person who was unusually kind to me. She worked at a Casey's General Store, one that I was frequently kicked out of. She invited me to come in, though. She was a smoker and I was a smoker, and so she would give me cigarettes, and we would sit there, and as she checked people out, she would talk about her newfound faith. She invited me to come to her house, and she introduced me to her kids and to her husband, and there I ate with them, and that night they invited me to come to church, and I went to a small Methodist church the next day. I didn't know it at the time, but they had got people to pray for me. And so when I went in there, people welcomed me. They were warm. They greeted me. There were some people looking at me suspiciously because my name was in the paper and everybody knew or thought they knew about me. The pastor was unusually kind. I didn't know what he preached on, but as I look back on it, I could see he was so much like Jesus. That was Sunday. The next Friday, I got arrested again for stealing a bottle of alcohol from a local convenience store, and I was promptly arrested. I knew I was headed to prison. I was out on bail for a serious felony, and I had just committed a serious misdemeanor, and I knew it was not looking good for me. In my jail cell, I cried out to God. I was 18, I had quit school, I was going nowhere in my life except headed to prison. So the only thing I knew to do was to go back to that alcohol and drug treatment program, and I checked myself in. They welcomed me back too. As part of the program, you have to give your life story about 10 days in, and you have to pray for honesty and humility. So I began to do that. I prayed to a God I did not know. And then it came time for me to give my life story. And the next day in group therapy, I sat around and everybody began to give me feedback. Except I couldn't justify myself. In fact, I was told not to speak at all, but just to take it in. They told me things I didn't want to hear. I was a proud person. I blamed other people for my problems. I was just trying to escape punishment. And they were right. I stood up that day in the middle of that therapy and I walked out. I quit. To them, it looked like I was giving up, but I wasn't. I didn't need anybody to tell me what a mess my life was. I needed a way out. So when I went back to my hometown, I didn't know what to do, except I sought this couple out who were nice to me. They happened to be at the small Methodist church. It was midweek and they were preparing for the weekend services, and I stumbled in there on a cold winter's night in February 1990, and they welcomed me. Joel took me into the sanctuary and sat there in a dark sanctuary, and he said, "Jody, if you give your life to Jesus Christ, he will set you free from all your sin." He told me that he was an alcoholic before, but that he had been delivered through the power of Jesus. He asked me if I wanted to give my life to Jesus, and I was ready. I went down and I knelt at the altar with him, and he led me in a prayer, and then he prayed for me and said, "I'm going to go over to the side. I'll be in the other room. You sit here and talk to God and let me know when you're done." There I was all by myself. I had never prayed really before. And all I could do was weep and just say, "Jesus, help me." I don't know if it was a minute or 20 minutes or longer, but something happened. I went from crying and sobbing to standing up with a firm conviction and an unspeakable joy. I didn't have language for it at the time, but I had been born again, delivered from that terrible life of addiction. I began to walk out and told him what happened, and he smiled and gave me a Bible. And the next day I was walking around town with a cigarette in one hand and a Bible in the other, testifying to what Jesus had done. Fast forward a couple of years, and I had gone on a mission trip to the former Soviet Union. I saw what God was doing in the world, and I wanted to join him. So I moved here to Arkansas, and I joined a missionary organization. Life was going well for me. It was the summer of 1994. I had been walking with God for 4+ years. I was now a missionary going all around the world. And then I went rappelling along the Buffalo River and had a terrible accident where I fell 170 feet. I was so stunned by the fall, I was broken. My eye and my lip were filled with blood. I was writhing around in pain. I was powerless. My friend who was with me went to get help, and there I was alone, writhing around in pain, and the thought came I needed to pray, but I couldn't. As I dealt with the reality that I was fallen and broken, and I was so uncertain about what had happened, I heard the voice of God speak to me, and it said, "My son, you are powerless. All you can do is trust me." As I heard those words from God, I responded with, "My God, I'm at your mercy." And the instant reply came, "My son, isn't that how you always are, at my mercy?" In that moment, I decided that I needed to surrender fully to Jesus. And so I said to God, if I die, I will be with you forever. I'm okay with that. If I'm paralyzed, I will glorify you. But if you raise me up, I will go anywhere and do anything you ask me to do. I surrender. As I said that, and the paramedics were taking me through the woods into the open field to a helicopter that was waiting, as I surrendered in my heart, I experienced a flood of peace with a scripture verse that said, I am confident that I will see the goodness of God in the land of the living. And it was in that moment that I knew everything was going to be okay. Fortunately, I was taken to a local hospital, and there I was attended to, but I was amazed at how God had rescued me in that moment. They took a piece of bone out of my hip and fused it into my side and sewed me back up, and now I walk with the full knowledge that I have been rescued, not just from addiction, that I had experienced the power of God to set me free, but the presence of God in the midst of my pain. It's those two experiences of deliverance from addiction and God's presence in the midst of my broken pain that have made me and shaped me who I am. Friends, all of those things come out in all that I do and how I organize life in the church, in my preaching, in my teaching, in my living. I wanted to just take those moments to share that faith story with you. Now, my story is not your story, but you have a story. And I want to encourage you to figure out how to tell that story, and tell that story with anyone that you can, because when we are active in sharing our faith, we will have a deeper and more richer understanding of what our faith actually gives us. I hope that you've been blessed by hearing that. I hope that you'll share your faith. I'll see you Sunday.